The founder of the WikiLeaks website says he's been the target of a smear campaign carried out by significant forces. But he insists his website will still release thousands of classified military documents concerning the war in Afghanistan. Is whistleblowing a criminal act, or is it the future of investigative journalism? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. A new twist in the WikiLeaks saga as Swedish authorities issued and then withdrew an arrest warrant for the site's founder, Julian Assange. He says the accusations of rape and sexual molestation made against him were fabricated, part of a campaign to undermine WikiLeaks and its work. Zainab Waji has the story.
Dirty tricks. This was Julian Assange's reaction to an arrest warrant against him for rape. Although the allegations were withdrawn 6 hours later, in an exclusive interview with Al Jazeera, Assange insisted he had been set up.
It is clearly a smear campaign, and we can see that the allegation was withdrawn and 6 hours later. The only question is who was involved. But without direct evidence, I would not be willing to make a direct allegation.
Only last month, WikiLeaks stirred controversy with the release of 75,000 classified US military documents containing information relating to the war in Afghanistan. Though Obama and his spokespeople dismissed the leaked documents as old news, administration officials nonetheless condemned the website, suggesting its founder had blood on his hands.
The battlefield consequences of the release of these documents are potentially severe and dangerous for our troops, our allies, and Afghan partners, and may well damage our relationships and reputation in that key part of the world.
But while a war-weary American public has a limited appetite for intricate details of US foreign policy, Assange feels websites like his have a responsibility to make public the realities on the ground.
Documented the deaths of 20,000 people killed in that war on both sides, and hundreds of clear cases of previously unreported civilian killings by the United States military. The Pentagon so far says that it is not aware of any incident of people coming to harm by what we have released.
That I no longer have a strong...
Traditionally, divulging secrets could remove presidents. The Watergate scandal famously led to the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Come on, fire!
Up to now, WikiLeaks' achievements have been more modest, although their track record remains impressive.
Yeah, we lost 2 birds. We're still firing.
Arguably, it has taken public interest investigating to a new level, one that can utilize the immediacy of electronic age to great effect. Relying on a global network of whistleblowers, WikiLeaks has so far managed to stay one step ahead of the US authorities, using highly complex encryption to deter hackers. Based in Sweden, where the journalist's most prized weapon, the refusal to reveal sources, is enshrined in law, it has steadfastly refused to divulge the origins of its often controversial reports. And Assange has no plans to take a step back. His profile continues to soar, and he plans to reveal a further 15,000 classified documents in the near future. Despite the ongoing controversy, it seems that Julian Assange has no plans to invoke his right to remain silent. Zainab Waji for Inside Story.
So, is WikiLeaks a threat to global security or a necessary, if sometimes ugly, attempt at holding politicians to account? Joining me on the show to discuss the issue are, from Rio de Janeiro, Glenn Greenwald, a lawyer and a columnist at Salon.com. In Rome, Stefania Maruzzi is an investigative journalist and contributes to the Italian news magazine L'Espresso. And in Washington, D.C., James Joyner is managing editor of the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for being with us today. James Joyner, let me begin with you. Is Julian Assange a crusading journalist and a contributor to democracy, or something altogether worse?
I think altogether worse. I think he may see himself as that, but I think what he's doing is potentially quite dangerous. He's basically taking unto himself the ability to decide what information that various coalition governments have deemed to be classified that should be open to the public, which is to say not only the people within our democracies, but also the people that we're fighting, the Taliban and others. And I think that puts lives in danger, not only the lives of people whose names are in the documents, but also the people who are relying on that intelligence and it may not be trusted in the future.
Stefania Marizzi, we hear those kind of complaints leveled at almost every investigative journalist, and the suggestion that somehow holding politicians to account is something that we can do without is something that I suspect that you've had to deal with a lot. How do you feel about the situation?
Well, basically, I think WikiLeaks is a sort of answer to a real problem in our democracy, which is the overwhelming secrecy. You know, people is getting more and more frustrated, even in our democracy, where there are huge problems in getting access to crucial documents, which are crucial for democratic debate. So I think we need the WikiLeaks for the moment, at least for the moment.
All right. Glenn Greenwald, I mean, I guess one of the implicit suggestions here is that the mainstream press does a perfectly adequate job in holding governments to account and in revealing information on a more responsible basis. Is WikiLeaks going too far?
Well, the complaint that James voiced about WikiLeaks is exactly the same one that's applicable and applied to media outlets, which is when they publish government secrets, they're accused of being the ones who take it upon themselves to decide what we should know and what we shouldn't know. And what people who voice that complaint ignore is that the real problem is not an excess of disclosure. There's no evidence that WikiLeaks or any disclosures of the last decade that people have complained about have caused any harm to anyone. Even the Pentagon admits that. But what's ignored is how dangerous and anti-democratic excessive government secrecy is. It prevents people from being accountable to the public. It enables the government to do all sorts of untoward things without the public knowing about it. And what there is a huge amount of evidence for is that the government has systematically abused its secrecy powers, and there's very few institutions, including the media, that have actually provided a meaningful check on that, and WikiLeaks is doing that.
There are 2 points there. Let me put aside for the moment, if I can, the issue of excessive government secrecy, James Joyner, and just address the issue of what the role of the press should be, because as Glenn Greenwald pointed out there, even the New York Times, which hardly anyone these days can claim is a rabble-rouser, will say the same things and will be subject to the same criticisms. So from your perspective, what is the role of the journalist, and to what extent should we be holding governments accountable and revealing information that will actually make people sit up and take notice?
Well, one, I would reject the assumption that WikiLeaks is journalism. There's no journalism going on.
I'm not making that
WikiLeaks.
assertion. I'm just asking for a baseline here, a benchmark that you work by. What exactly would you think is acceptable in the role of a journalist?
Sure, I think journalists have a role to hold government accountable, absolutely, even during wartime, and even maybe especially in their conduct of war. They should take what government officials say. They should do investigation. They should get on the scene as much as they can. And I think they're in fact doing that thing.
Well, let me stop you there for a minute. Let me stop you there for a minute.
Sure.
Glenn Greenwald, do you agree? Do journalists do enough to maintain those standards that James Joyner has just assessed?
No, not remotely enough. I mean, most of the way that we've learned about the horrible things that our government did over the last decade that were secret were from whistleblowers leaking. And oftentimes the media has been cooperative with the government in helping suppress it. I mean, the New York Times in 2004 learned about the illegal NSA wiretapping program that the Bush administration had instituted, and the Bush administration urged them not to publish it. And they sat on it for a year until after Bush was safely reelected. When the Washington Post learned of the CIA black sites, they, at the government's request, withheld the locations, even the countries in which those prisons were located, so that they could continue to operate, meaning aiding and abetting the government's illegal secret prison network. And so the media is far too cooperative with the government, and WikiLeaks is an antidote to that.
So, Stefania, I mean, from your perspective as someone who is performing this necessary task of holding governments to account, do you feel free in actually performing that task? Do you think that the kind of pressures that WikiLeaks is now coming under are just part of the business that you're involved in?
Yes, I think so. I think WikiLeaks WikiLeaks' role is actually positive, both for the public debate on the war, but also for the role of press and journalism. I think their role is very positive in stimulating investigative works, which is the most important work for the press. And in addition, I think many journalists are starting to understand the importance of collaborating with WikiLeaks. I'm pretty sure many journalists, more and more journalists, will cooperate with WikiLeaks.
Do you think, Stefania, that this entire episode, and in fact WikiLeaks as an organization, is beginning to change the fabric and the perspective of how we look at these issues?
Well, I think so. Basically, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe, that was impossible. It was impossible to find a way to send such a huge amount of documents, of secret documents, to an organization. Of course, now we have electronic form of documents, so everything is much more easy. And I think journalists will start to appreciate this possibility.
So, James, you said earlier on you don't think WikiLeaks is journalism, but if we now have a news environment and a communications environment in which this kind of information is becoming so much easier to release, surely we have to begin to conceive of a universe in which this kind of behavior is going to become more common and consider how to approach it.
I don't think there's any question about that. Yeah, I think that's right. It's you know, we live in it. You know, we have terrorism, we have crime, we have you know, people you know, breaking the law and leaking classified information, and government has to deal with these things. It doesn't make them good things, but yeah, absolutely. But the way that we're going to deal with this, unfortunately, I think, is to stovepipe our information further. We're going to make sure that young privates probably don't you know, have the vetting background that you know, apparently the main perpetrator here didn't have. I think we'll make sure those people don't get it.
Okay. Well,
and more importantly, I think that
sorry to interrupt. I mean, you know, you use phrases like breaking the law and revealing classified information, and these are the issues that we're talking about here. So again, let me just sort of find a benchmark here for what you're talking about, and let's go back to the classic case, the Pentagon Papers. You know, the relevance of information in the conduct of democracy in that case, in retrospect, was clear, but before that had happened, would this not have been subject to the same criticisms you're making now?
Oh, sure. I mean, the difference, though, is at least that there was a collaboration, I think, between the Post, the Times, and the government ultimately in doing this thing. And I think that more importantly, I think that the Post and the Times and you know, other you know, major media outlets are perceived as good actors. I think that they are people who you know, are citizens, you know, do take things seriously. They're not activists out to undermine a mission and destroy a cause. I think.
Glenn,
they're very different things.
Glenn, the language of activists and decent actors and responsible people, again, part of the common discourse over many, many decades. I mean, where does one draw the lines here? And how do you think this whole WikiLeaks episode is going to perhaps redraw the environment that we're in?
Well, interestingly, Daniel Ellsberg himself has said that the leak that we just saw was probably the most significant one since he leaked the Pentagon Papers. He's compared it to what he did and said that Julian Assange and people at WikiLeaks are heroes. You know, and I think that and I would also add that WikiLeaks actually did seek to get the Pentagon's help in trying to redact the names of innocent Afghans and was refused. So to the extent there's a responsibility, I think it lies at the Pentagon. But the real point, I think, is that the one James just actually made, which is that the media outlets are perceived as good actors, meaning that they will do what the government often tells them to do. And they're subject to the powers of the government. So sources who leak to those media outlets are in danger of being exposed and of being prosecuted. What WikiLeaks provides is a secretive environment that protects sources and that is structured so as to prevent the government from being able to punish the people who disclose and leak. And I think that's one of its true values.
Stefania, are you a good actor, or would you, as an investigative journalist, fall foul of governments who perhaps are trying to keep secrets rather than have you reveal them?
Well, of course, we had the duty to to listen to as many people as possible. But you know, I think we had to keep ourselves independent. So we had to go ahead with our investigation. Of course, it is our duty to protect sources, to be sure that no innocent people would be harmed by our articles and investigation. But as far as my experience is concerned, WikiLeaks has a good standard in protecting sources. This is my experience, of course. I don't know what happened with this huge amount of documents leaked, but when I was involved, when I collaborated with them, I realized, I was impressed by the way they were handling sources safely.
Let's get back to the point that Glenn made a little earlier on, and that is the other side of this equation, and that government attempts to keep things secret. Glenn, we're talking here about the possibility that organizations like WikiLeaks and the blogs and the internet are changing the landscape of information communication, and also changing the way the governments respond to this. Do you think the government is going to win out in this situation, or do you think that WikiLeaks and its kind will actually succeed in perhaps bringing forward a much more robust measure of journalistic intrusion into government business?
Well, this is really, I think, the major war that's currently taking place. And you actually see this with governments such as the United Arab Emirates and other governments in that region, which are attempting now to prohibit the use of BlackBerries or to limit them because they prevent the government from monitoring communications. This is what is most important to governments and all power factions, is the ability to control the flow of information. And what WikiLeaks represents is a major threat to that ability. And so I do think you're going to start to see the U.S. government significantly intensify its efforts to block these kind of technological advancements. You already saw a 2008 Pentagon report talking about ways to destroy the credibility of WikiLeaks, to ruin their reputation, to prevent them from operating. Governments around the world are attempting to do that. And I think, like all efforts to prevent technology, it will ultimately fail. But there will definitely be a major war that takes place in order to preserve the ability of governments and other people in power to do what they do behind a wall of secrecy.
And James, if, as you said, WikiLeaks is straying too far on the side of revealing classified information, where do you draw the line for governments? I mean, to what extent should a government be trying to throttle the journalistic trade and trying to control the amount of information that the public gets access to?
I think that, in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy, I think those are two very different standards. I think in domestic policy, transparency should be foremost, with very, very little secrecy, just enough to protect the free flow of information, and candor. In terms of foreign policy, and especially I think national security policy and intelligence policy, I think government is the actor that ultimately has to make the call.
Why should American citizens have a better standard of access to information than those people in Afghanistan in whose name these actions are being carried out, but who are bearing the brunt of the problems?
I'm not sure I follow your question.
Well, you're talking about two levels of judgment here, one for domestic citizens in the U.S. and another for everybody else. I'm not quite sure why we should be applying different standards. I'm talking about domestic policy versus foreign policy. I think the health care debate or Social Security reform or tax increases and that sort of thing should be done completely in the open, or as close to completely open as possible. I think fighting wars and doing intelligence collection is not something that is done openly. Glenn, is that a valid distinction? Is there a philosophical divide here?
There's a room for secrecy, but just look at the WikiLeaks video of the attack in Baghdad on the innocent civilians that they murdered from a helicopter. The media had been attempting for 2 years, Reuters, because it was their employees, were attempting for 2 years to get that video. WikiLeaks released it. There was nothing legitimately secret or about that video. What these secrets are designed to do is to prevent the American people and the people around the world from seeing and knowing what the U.S. government and its allies are really doing when it invades and bombs and occupies other countries. That's what this secrecy, first and foremost, is designed to enable, and that's why WikiLeaks is so valuable.
Stefania, from the perspective of the working journalist, what about the corporate role in getting information out? Because the relationship between news, big corporations and government is one that has been speculated upon and investigated quite a lot. Do you find that the corporations and your ability to break news are combined, intertwined in some way? And is it a problem?
Well, I think actually journalists are getting more and more frustrated about the possibility of having access to information apart from official information, and this is the reason why media people are interested in collaborating with WikiLeaks. But let me tell you something about the controversy on the names of Afghani people exposed by WikiLeaks. I mean, let's think about this story. I mean, if the Pentagon people are really worried about these people, about the lives of these people, why then don't help WikiLeaks to edit those names? I mean, those Afghani people are their sources, so they have some precise duty towards their sources. So I think the Pentagon should help WikiLeaks to edit these names. I'm convinced they should do this.
Well, clearly at the moment the Pentagon has been trying to marginalize WikiLeaks, and the role of the Pentagon is unfortunately something we'll have to discuss in another show. But as we come to the end of this show, James, let me just come back to the broader picture and how journalism, if you like, and how the dissemination of information is going to develop, because it seems that we will have an increasing tension between sites like WikiLeaks and governments. Do you think we're going to see an explosion of whistleblowers now on the back of all of this? And if so, would that be a good thing?
I think it will be a mixed bag. I think there is doubtless information that governments, even our governments and other Western democracies, keep from the people that shouldn't be kept, and they do it for political reasons rather than true national security reasons. I don't think there's any doubt about that, or that we overclassify. But at the end of the day, I mean, I would prefer the elected officials to make that decision rather than Julian Assange and others with an axe to grind.
Glenn,
but governments will have to adapt.
Glenn, who has to make that decision then? What is legitimate? What is someone who has an axe to grind?
Well, I think what we know is that if you leave it to government officials to do it, what you get is extreme abuse and corruption and illegality being shielded from the public. So we need an alternative. And is it possible that if we can go too far in the other direction? Sure, that is theoretically possible. But we are so far in the direction now of excessive secrecy and a lack of accountability that before we're even close to that danger, far more adjustments and increases in disclosure need to be made. We're not even close to the point where we can even have the debate about, is there too much disclosure?
And there we will have to leave the conversation, I'm afraid. We're right out of time. Thank you for joining us, all of you. Glenn Greenwald in Rio de Janeiro, Stefania Maurizzi in Rome, and in Washington, D.C., James Joyner. And thank you all so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and your suggestions on the show, so please email them to us. The address, insidestory@aljazeera.net. But it's goodbye for now.